All right, so lastly in the unit for genetics, we're going to be looking at applications in genetics and just basically a few ideas out there to help us understand the field and some of the things that are currently going on in genetics or have gone on throughout all history. One of those things is selective breeding. Selective breeding is where people, us, select desirable traits and then continue to do so until desired phenotype is achieved. Dog breeding is the perfect example of this. Wolves are basically the ancestor for all domestic dogs. And obviously, wolves have some great traits about them, but domestic is not one of those traits. And so throughout history, people decided, you know what, it would be great to be a dog or not be a dog, to have a dog, because they work and they do things and companionship and that whole thing. And so it started as simple as picking the most docile wolves and then picking the most docile wolves out of that bunch. And you continue to do so until you have a wolf that is completely docile. And then you start to pick traits that you like. Well, we're going to pick the one that works the best or whatever it is. And then now, fast forward, several hundred years later, you have people that say, I want a dog that I can fit in my pocket, or I want a dog that can jump really high, or I want a dog that fill in the blank. And so we went from dogs being kind of work animals to dogs being like toys. And so that's why you have like everything from whatever that kind of dog is. Actually, I don't see any real dogs really on. I guess there's maybe a couple of real dogs on here, but mostly it's like, anyway, you get the idea. Okay. And then there is this idea of inbreeding. So inbreeding and selective breeding are very closely related. And mostly when we think of inbreeding, we think of like, you know what you think of when you think of inbreeding, but a lot of selective breeding has to do with inbreeding, because when you find a group of, say, this particular dog has the trait that I want, well, you breed them with the other pets in that litter in order to keep that trait. And so the purpose of inbreeding is to keep particular traits around. However, it can bring out this what's called deleterious alleles, which most creatures in the wild are homozygous dominant for anything that is bad, because homozygous dominant is so strong against the bad things, or at least heterozygous for that. Well, if there's a couple of heterozygous that inbreed, then you can have those deleterious traits start to come out. And so if you look throughout history, if you study different things, like look up Sir Charles II in the Spanish dynasty, for instance, if you want to understand the outcome of something like that. And you see this in dog breeds too. German Shepherds are a great example. I only know this because I grew up and I have German Shepherds and I love them. They have a high incidence of something called hip dysplasia. This is an inbred genetic trait to their breed. A dog that we would call like a mutt doesn't have this trait because they don't have these deleterious genes bred into their breed, because they don't really have a breed. You get the idea. All right. So next is just the concept of genetic engineering. Real quick and simple, genetic engineering is making changes to the DNA code or of an organism. And basically, DNA can be extracted, can be cut, and can be read using lots of different techniques. And you can put that DNA into another organism, and you can change that organism. Could be as simple as changing bacteria. We do this all the time. Great example is we used to use pig insulin for people who had diabetes, but we no longer need to do that because we're able to farm our own insulin by teaching bacteria how to make it. We put our human insulin gene into bacteria and they are able to farm it for us, which is kind of nice, because bacteria are bacteria and we can use them to do that. And it's an exact match for what people need, or changing plants and that sort of thing. And so when you start changing organisms, This is something called a transgenic organism, basically an organism that has had its genes changed as a result of some sort of genetic engineering. You can do this with animals, as I mentioned. When I mentioned bacteria, you can do this with animals. Most commonly, it is done with animals and plants that we eat. And this is where you get something called genetically modified foods or genetically modified organisms or GMOs, which you're familiar with. GMOs, just food that have been genetically modified. That's it. That just means that their DNA is different. There's no real danger to them. But there you go. I put this sign up here, warning, food contains DNA. I saw a funny video where they did this. They put that at a grocery store in the produce section, and no one went into the produce section that whole day, which was just kind of funny. All food contains DNA because, it was living at one point. And that brings us next to vaccines. Vaccines are basically a virus that is not a functioning virus. Without going into a whole lot of detail, we talked about this a little bit in the immune system. There's basically a piece of the virus that the immune system recognizes and is triggered against. And so we take that piece and you create this vaccine. And so you inject that into people, and their immune system will react against it and form a defense against it, but they don't actually get the real virus. And so there's nothing in their bodies replicating and destroying cells and whatnot. It's just building up the immune system. And so you get all the immunities without the risk of developing symptoms of the disease or spreading that disease, which is really good. Very good thing. And gene therapy is basically using other organisms, and I say organisms, but not really organisms. Viruses are the main vector here. You see this in this picture. And you can use that to insert healthy genes or some other sort of gene into a person to change their genome. This is one proposed strategy for curing disorders like cystic fibrosis, where every gene and every cell doesn't know how to make the lungs correctly. And so then you give them a virus that causes their DNA to change, causes them to make the correct gene, which could possibly rework their whole lungs. Pretty cool. You could use this also to cure a cancer tumor. You correct the tumor suppressing gene, and it all of a sudden turns that off, and the tumor stops growing, theoretically. So I think it's a pretty neat thing. Still a lot of development. Could also be used, obviously, for things that are not so moral. Then there's cloning. Speaking of morality, there's so much of what we talk about, especially in the field of genetics, that kind of breaches that gap between science and ethics. And cloning is one of those things. Animals have been cloned for years now. Supposedly, no person has ever been cloned. And so basically, cloning is creating an identical organism using adult DNA and then unfertilized egg. Without going into detail, there's a lot more there. But, obviously, look at the picture. It could be used for unethical means. And then lastly, there is stem cell research. Stem cells are basically cells that have not undergone cell specialization yet, and they're able to become any kind of cell. Embryos provide for us the best source of stem cells because these cells don't have a job yet, and so they can become any kind of cell. It's harder to achieve this with adult stem cells because usually with adult stem cells they have already kind of specialized, like you can see there on the graph on the left. There are blood stem cells that know how to become any kind of blood cell. And so the main goal of embryonic stem cell research is to use fixed damaged organs or to grow things that you're missing. And so that could be very good, especially for people who have traumatic injuries, traumatic nervous injuries especially, and it could be really a thing. But as with everything that we've talked about really so far today, there are some ethical concerns there, but that's beyond the class or beyond the scope of this class. We're just mainly talking about the concept of this, which generally is a good thing.